Hello everyone. In today's video, we're going to learn one of the most important concepts in C++ programming, which is functions. So far, we've been writing everything inside the main function, and as programs grow, this becomes messy and hard to manage. So a function is a block of reusable code that we write once, and we can call whenever we need it. So before we get started, let's see the following. So we have two main types of functions: value returning function and void functions. A void function is a function that performs a task, but it does not return any value. Value returning functions are functions that perform a task and return a value type, whether integer, double, character, and so forth. And the format we're going to follow today is we're going to start with the function prototype. So the function prototype syntax is shown as follows. So we start with the function type. If it's a void, this will be void. If it's a value returning function, this will be an int, double, and so forth. Followed by the function name. This is of your choice, but try to make it intuitive as much as possible. And then inside parentheses, if we're going to pass any parameters to this function, so we're going to have one parameter or multiple parameters. For multiple parameters, we can separate them by comma, and they do not have to be the same type. So we can pass integers, doubles, characters, and so on. So in today's video, we're going to cover three examples. So we're going to start with the simplest one, a void function that does not take any parameters. The second example, we're going to have a value returning function, a function that returns an integer value but does not take any parameters. So that's why we don't have anything between the parentheses. And the third example, a value returning function that returns a double and takes three parameters: an integer parameter A, integer parameter B, and a character that we called OP. So let's go back to Visual Studio and get started. Let's start with the simplest type, which is the void function. So we're going to have the type is void, and then the function name, let's call it SayHello. And then in between parentheses, we're not going to pass any parameters, so we're going to leave it empty, and then terminate by semicolon. So this here called the function prototype, which basically it tells the compiler that this function exists before the main. If we do not have this, we're going to have an error. So next, inside main, we're going to call this function. To call this function, we can just like type the name of it, SayHello, and then parentheses followed by semicolon. So now we call this function. And then after main, we're going to have the function definition, basically what we want this function to do. And the function definition will start with the function prototype followed by curly brackets. And then what we want this function to do, we want to write out to the console, hello, welcome to functions. We can start a new line. So now when we execute this program, inside main, we're calling this function. So we're going to jump to wherever this function is and then execute what's inside it. So let's debug it. And then we're going to see on the console this sentence here. Hello, welcome to functions. So what happens if we call this function one more time? So we can call it again, and then basically we should see this twice because we're going to execute this function 2 times. And then as we noticed, we can see this sentence twice on the output console. So the benefits of using functions is that we can write it one time and call it inside the main whenever we need it. So now let's move one step forward. So let's see a function that returns a value but still takes no inputs. So this function will return a value, which is a type integer. So int, and then we're gonna give it a name. So let's call it get result. And then we don't want to pass any parameter to this function, so we're gonna leave it empty with empty parentheses. So now inside the main function, in order to call this function, because this is a value returning function, so we're gonna have int result equal the name of the function followed by the parentheses. And then cout result is result. Let's also end it with a new line. And next, let's move to the function definition. So where we write the function prototype followed by the function body. So let's copy the function prototype without a semicolon and then followed by curly brackets. And then inside it, we're gonna write our code. So let's just like have a 2 integers and then do the summation for them. So let's define an integer a. So let's define it as type integer, and then also another integer b. Let's give it a value of 5. And then what we want to return, we want to return a plus b, for example. So return a plus b. So now when we return this value, a plus b will get stored in result. When we run this program, we should see 15 on the output. So this is it. So this function here calculates a value and sends it back to main using a return. So main stores it and prints it to the console. So now let's move to something more powerful, which is a function that takes inputs and perform different operations. So the return type from this function, we're gonna return a double value. So we're gonna give it a double type. And then the name of this function, let's call it calculate. And then we want to pass some parameters into this function. So we're going to pass an integer type A, an integer type B, and then a character, let's call it op for operation. So this is the function prototype. So inside the main, so let's define our variables. So int A, and it doesn't have to be A, we can call it int X, Y, and then a character, let's call it operation. So the reason I name it something different because the order that matters, not the name. So A will be mapped to X, B will be mapped to Y, and then op will be mapped to operation. So first we're going to ask the user to enter the first input. So we're going to write cout, enter first number, and then we're going to store it in X. And then second, we're going to ask the user to enter the second number, then we're going to store it in Y variable. And then third, we're going to ask the user to enter the operation they want to perform. So cout, enter operation, and then we mean summation, subtraction, multiplication, or division. And then we're going to store it in operation. So now what we want to do, we want to call this function, but this function is returning a value of type double. So in order to call this function, we're going to have a double result, and then also the name of the function, calculate. But when we have parameters, we just like type the parameter name, which is A, B, or op. We call them inside the main, we call them X, Y, and operation. And then since we're returning the result, so we want to output the result out to the screen, to the console. So cout result is result. Let's start a new line. And then at the end of the main, we're going to return 0 if everything compiled without errors. So next, let's move to the function definition. So for the function definition, we get the function prototype the way it is without the semicolon. Let's paste it here, followed by the function body in between curly brackets. So let's start. If the user enter op is, if he entered the plus sign, then result is equal A plus B. As we notice, we see an error under result. It says it's undefined, and which is very important note. If we define result inside the main function or any variable, it doesn't get recognized inside the other functions because those are like two different sections or two different houses. What's inside here is not being seen from this function, and what's inside this function is not being recognized inside this function. So we need to declare our variable result again here. So double result. So now we don't see this error anymore. So else if the user enter the minus sign, so result is equal to A minus B. And then let me copy this block here. For the multiplication, if he entered the multiplication sign, we want to return A times B to the result. And then if he entered the division sign, so we want to return A divided by B. And else, if he doesn't enter anything, we want to return or result equals 0. And then at the end of this function, because it's a value returning type and we're returning the result, so let's return result. So let's look at this program again. So we started with the function prototype. It takes 3 inputs, an integer type A, integer type B, and character. We called it op and return a value of type double. And then inside the main, we defined our variables. We can define them the same, int A, B, and character OP, but I intentionally define them as something else because I want to show you those will be mapped. So X will be mapped to A, Y to B, and operation to op, and so forth. We're asking the user to enter inputs, and then here we call the function, and then we're printing result to the screen. And then inside the main function, so the function definition, we're actually writing what we want this function to accomplish. So now let's run this program. So if the user enter the first number 5, the second number 5, and let's perform a multiplication. So we're returning result is 25. Let me highlight something important for the division. So we want our result to be double type, but let's say we enter 5 and then the second input is 2 and then we divide 5 divided by 2, that should be 2.5, but we're returning an integer type, so we're losing the decimal part of it. So in order to return a double type, so what we can do in the division, we can type double in between parentheses. So now we ensure we're returning a double. So let's run this program. Let's enter 5 again, 2 for the second input, do division. Now we see the result is 2.5. So this is called typecasting. I hope this video was helpful on functions. Thanks for watching.
Enjoyed this video? Subscribe to the Computer Engineering Notebook for more tutorials on computer architecture, embedded systems, and hardware design. And hit the bell to catch the next one.